Two simultaneous sword blows killed Piers Gaveston. One beheaded him, the other pierced his chest. Perhaps it was a symbol of piercing the heart of England's king, Edward II. It is said to have been his love that cost Gaveston his life on this day in June 1312. To this day it is considered a fact in many places that the Earl of Cornwall and the monarch shared a romantic relationship. Modern historians, however, have doubted this for some time now. Time and again this has led to some derisive reactions. The evidence seems too clear that Edward and Gaveston were lovers and not brothers from different parents, as the king himself repeatedly characterized the relationship. Anyone who thinks the two are lovers is quickly inclined to want to correct the historical judgment about the king as a whole. He could be the victim of a homophobic historiography. But are such considerations really justified? Or do they run into the void? What was the king's relationship with the knight from Gascony? As a spoiler, I think it was both. They thought of each other as brothers, but actually had a love affair. What seems strange to us in the 21st century may have been the only way Edward could explain his relationship with Gaveston at the beginning of the 14th century. But first things first. It is said to have been the year 1300 that Piers Gaveston received a call for help from his king. Edward I was concerned about his son and heir of the same name. Prince Edward showed no interest in the business of government. In particular, he disliked military tasks. In fact, he was to receive 2 commandos in the coming years to prove himself. Both projects ended in disaster. For Edward I, who defined his kingship essentially in terms of military success, this was intolerable. Gaveston was supposed to act as a mentor to his son to get him on the right track. On paper, he was the perfect choice. Since Gaveston came from Gascony, he had no network of friendships at court that he could abuse to rise to the top. He was also the son of the knight Arnaud de Gaveston, who was loyal to Edward and accompanied the king on numerous campaigns. The monarch is also said to have valued Gaveston's intelligence, cultured demeanor, and courtly manners in addition to his military prowess. Gaveston is believed to have been 4 years older than the future Edward II. But again and again there is a reference to the fact that both men were born in 1284 in the sources. Ian Mortimer, however, in my eyes rightly rejects this, as Gaveston fought on a campaign in Flanders in 1297. It is not completely impossible that he did this as a 13-year-old. It is more likely that he was already 16 or 17. After his service in Flanders, Gaveston marched with the royal army against the Scots and had probably earned the king's respect here. The monarch therefore asked him to enter his son's household. The first part of the king's hope was soon to come true. His son and his new mentor quickly developed a close friendship. Prince Edward listened to Gaveston. Then, however, 2 processes became apparent that the monarch had not foreseen. First, it became obvious that Gaveston's exactly courtly manners were an exclusive gift to the royal family. He treated the country's barons with arrogance that more than once drifted in pure contempt. The prince also saw this behavior as a role model. Second, the prince's friendship with his mentor quickly became too close for the king's taste. Edward was constantly asking for privileges and benefits for his best friend. There happened a remarkable overlap in history. Gaveston was temporarily appointed as an estate manager for Roger Mortimer, who was still a minor at the time. He was to depose Edward II about 20 years later, and presumably also had him murdered. It was not the only time that the paths of the 2 men who were largely responsible for the development of Edward II's reign crossed. Mortimer served under Gaveston in Ireland and was one of the few advocates he had during his life. In the chronicles, The relationship between Edward II and Gaveston at this time is described with words such as dissolute or excessive. Gaveston was therefore temporarily banished from the household along with Gilbert de Claret, another favorite of Prince Edward. The heir to the throne himself was also sent away from the court after a fierce dispute with Treasurer Walter Langton. At the beginning of 1306, however, all parties were officially reconciled. Prince Edward and Gaveston became Knights of the Bath in May. They were supposed to move to Scotland with the aging king, however, this prospect did not appeal to them. Prince Edward, Gaveston, Mortimer, and a few other knights preferred to travel to the continent and take part in some tournaments. In January 1307, after intervention from his wife, the king was once again reconciled with his son. But there was no place for Gaveston at court any longer. He was sent into exile on February 26, 1307, but he received the considerable annual pension of 100 marks. This suggests that Edward I did not consider Gaveston to be the real problem. However, the exile should not even last long enough to cost half of the annual pension. The king died in July 1307. This cleared the way for Gaveston's return. The news of his father's death reached Edward II while hunting. His first two decisions, which he is said to have made on the spot, were to become a symbol for his entire reign. In the first place, he immediately had Langton, by whom he had been banished from the court, arrested. And secondly, he had Gaveston recalled. Edward was a vindictive, favorite, fixated man who always did what he wanted to do, and Gaveston was the person who encouraged him to do so. This would sooner or later put both men on a collision course with the barons. But it didn't have to be this way. The nobility of the country actually accommodated Edward when he took office. His first parliament approved, without any debate, a tax to pay for the upcoming coronation and his wedding to Isabella, the daughter of the French king. Edward also made Gaveston Earl of Cornwall in August 1307, giving him almost all of the property held by the last Earl of Cornwall. The title was actually reserved for members of the royal family. Nevertheless, 7 of the 11 English earls signed the corresponding legal document as witnesses, signaling their consent. Anyone who still doubted that Edward considered Gaveston as family had to bury those thoughts for good in November 1307. The new Earl of Cornwall married Margaret de Claret, a niece of Edward II. By the way, in case you are wondering how much of a history nerd I must be, I also did some research in the British National Archives for this video and found and described this letter from Margaret to Gaveston asking him for help with the problem as the Earl of Cornwall. But back to the topic. The barons knew that there were always two problems after every change of the crown. First, there was a generational conflict between the old court and the new one. Second, the new monarch had his own favorites. Those who had influence in the past lost it partially or completely. England, however, was under pressure to rush against the Scots. The barons therefore tried to keep the friction caused by these problems as low as possible, despite the fact that they despised Gaveston and probably did not find Edward particularly sympathetic either. That this did not work was due to Edward's and Gaveston's excessive behavior. At a tournament in December 1307, Gaveston is said to have humiliatingly defeated the Earls of Arundel, Hereford and Varennes. This is clearly stated in this Latin Chronicles excerpt, as I'm sure you can confirm. Just kidding, I also translated the text, of course. Here it is. Subsequently, Edward made Gaveston regent when he travelled to France for his wedding. This showed how he saw him, as the co-king. The new king also gave a key role to his favourite in the coronation of himself and Isabella. At the feast that followed, it was his and Gaveston's banner that adorned the room, not those of the then 12-year-old new queen. In addition, The king is said to have talked only to Gaveston the entire time, which is why the French delegation angrily left the celebration. That was too much. Gaveston had to go. The lords got together and drew up a list of grievances for which they expected the king to present solutions. The fact that he banished his favorite from the country was among them. Edward grudgingly agreed and made Gaveston his deputy in Ireland, where Gaveston did a quite good job. In the spring of 1309, Edward secured the return of Gaveston with the support of the Pope. The game restarted. The two men were only interested in themselves and their possessions. They did government business more badly than well. This time the barons decided to proceed decisively. They presented Edward with the so-called ordinances, a 41-point list of what would have to be changed. It effectively robbed the king of all his power, and even worse, point 20 was dedicated to Piers Gaveston. He would have to be banished from all English lands. There would be no return by the threat of his excommunication as well as his execution. Gaveston's name was even written in the margin in the original. In response, Edward made it clear where his priorities lay. With Gaveston, "You shall stop persecuting my brother Piers and allow him to have the earldom of Cornwall," he offered, and said he would agree to anything else in the ordinances. It was futile. Alternatively, Edward tried to get the Pope to annul the ordinances or to devote himself to a campaign against Scotland in order to avert attention. Nothing worked. Gaveston had to leave in the autumn of 1311. The only high nobleman who spoke out in favor of him was a certain Hugh le Despencer. However, the two men did not want to be separated for long. Gaveston returned before Christmas 1311. He and Edward were reunited in the rural north and resided together at Knaresborough Castle on January 13th, 1312. From here they went to York. Gaveston attended the baptism of his daughter in York. On January 18th, 1312, Edward officially announced the return of his favorite and revoked the ordinances by his own authority. Whatever the plan was to calm or subdue the barons didn't work. The lords around Thomas of Lancaster assembled an army. In March 1312, there was also a meeting of the nobility with their highest bishops to decide on Gaveston's arrest, and the hunters quickly got closer to their prey. Edward and his favorite narrowly escaped from Newcastle at the beginning of April. The king had to leave behind horses, much of his money, and some other treasures to save himself. He and Gaveston now separated. Edward went to York, while the Earl of Cornwall moved to Scarborough Castle. Here the army of the barons caught up to him. Fate was to take its course. Gaveston probably saw from the walls of the castle that was his refuge and knew that the end was close. The fortress was surrounded by a large army commanded by men who hated him. There wouldn't be a large enough army for Edward to raise to save him. He therefore agreed to negotiations. He wanted to surrender to the Earl of Pembroke, who would have to guarantee his safety in return. Moreover, if the king had not reconciled with the barons by August 1st, he was to be allowed to return to the castle. Pembroke agreed, swearing that Gaveston's life was safe. The lords Percy and Clifford also vouched for his safety. Gaveston was placed in a rectory in Oxfordshire on June 9th. Pembroke himself was not present. He had left to travel to his estates. The Earl of Warwick took advantage of the situation a day later. He entered the rectory with armed men and seized Gaveston by force. The king's favorite was taken to Warwick Castle. It was here that a show trial ensued, in which the men who hated Gaveston the most judged him. The defendant was not even allowed to speak. The verdict was clear from the get-go. Gaveston would die. The sentence was due to be carried out on June 19th. Gaveston was taken up Blacklow Hill in the early hours of the morning on the road leading to Kenilworth. This hill was on the property of Thomas of Lancaster, and this was no coincidence. The Earl was related to the king and ruled in the north of the country almost like a king. He had seen every setback in favor of Gaveston and every insult by the favourite as an attack on his honour, and now the day had come to settle the score. Edward should know that it was he who had Gaveston's heart pierced and his head cut off. Gaveston's body could not be buried for more than 2 years as he was still excommunicated. It was not until Edward obtained the Pope's annulment that he was able to have him buried in the monastery of King's Langley on January 2nd, 1315. The king himself is said to have felt anger as his first reaction to the news of his death. He had warned Gaveston not to go to Scarborough Castle, he is said to have scolded. Mourning followed. A chronicle attests that he mourned him like a father mourns a son. I don't think that Edward himself would agree with that. The anger and grief were followed by the desire for revenge. Edward wanted everyone dead, and that wish was to come true. The Earl of Pembroke switched sides after Gaveston's death. Too deep was the anger that Warwick and Lancaster had forced him to break his word that nothing would happen to Gaveston. The barons' camp was divided. None of the participants would survive Edward's reign, and neither would many innocents. Edward had even the men's wives imprisoned. Mass executions also became an essential part of his way of governing around 1320. Gaveston's family had a hard time at first. Widow Margaret had to fight for her property because her husband was excommunicated. The couple's daughter died at an early age. Edward, however, had not forgotten his niece and married her in 1317 to another of his favourites, Hugh de Audley. He also endowed them with rich possessions. In 1318, Hugh le Despencer the Younger became Edward's sole favourite and ousted Gaveston's widow and her new husband from the court. Since the two had also opposed Roger Mortimer, the situation did not improve even after the end of the reign of Edward II. The regent for Edward III would probably have confiscated all their possessions if he had not been overthrown and executed by Edward III. Only now did the situation stabilize. The new king, who was born 5 months after Gaveston's execution, was in nothing less interested than in the family of his father's favourite. This brings us to the question of this video. Was Gaveston just Edward's favourite or adopted brother or something more? Basically, to answer this, we need to look at the following options. First, they had a romantic relationship. Second, they had a sexual relationship. However, for Gaveston it was only a means to an end. It is conceivable that he was not even homosexual, but more on that in the next chapter. Third, they didn't have a romantic or sexual relationship, but they were actually just very close friends. For the most part, the arguments for romantic love affair echoed in the description of the events I just gave. Both men were strongly fixated on each other. They took great personal risks to be able to be together. This was to cost Gaveston his life. According to the Chronicle of Melzer, Edward is said to have particularly enjoyed sodomy. Gaveston, however, is not mentioned by name. It is also said in a chronicle that Gaveston is said to have worn Isabella's jewelry for Edward. After Gaveston's last banishment, Edward also showed himself in the colour of mourning. Would he have done so if only one very close friend or brother had been banished? According to the Lanarcost Chronicle, there was an undue intimacy between the two men. These arguments led Hamilton, for example, to conclude in his 1988 biography of Gaveston that there could be no doubt that the two men had been lovers. However, later historians, as I already mentioned, such as Pierre Chapulier, see this differently. By the way, I'm so sorry, I'm sure I butchered that name. And they have the following reasons for seeing this differently. The chronicles are from an Edward critical perspective. their veracity must therefore only be assessed with great caution. Direct contemporaries are very silent on the question of the relationship between the two. It seems unlikely that the French king would have married his daughter to a well-known homosexual. She was supposed to give birth to children after all. And she did. Edward had 4 legitimate children and 1 illegitimate child. Gaveston himself probably also had an illegitimate daughter, who was later to be lady-in-waiting to Philippa of Hainault. Even if one ascribes legitimate children to the fulfillment of duty in the Middle Ages, the question arises as to why illegitimate children occurred. I would also like to mention that it was actually quite typical to spread a message through clothing, in the absence of mass media and with a population that for the most part could neither read nor write. Simple symbols had to help. Edward's attire of mourning may therefore have been a strategy to alert the population to the fact that their ruler is in mourning. Years later, Isabella would resort to the same means to clearly communicate her displeasure with Yule the Spencer. So what's true? Basically, your judgment is as valid as mine. Nevertheless, I would like to share my thoughts with you. They are with Mark Ormrod, who emphasized the anachronism of talking about homosexuality in the Middle Ages. This concept simply didn't exist. Sodomy or bestial practices were the common terms. In this, the only accepted intimate relationship between men that could go beyond friendship were within the framework of family blood connections. I believe that from his point of view, Edward had told the truth. Brother was the image that came closest to his feelings for Gaveston, what he knew and what was acceptable. I do think that the two men were in the kind of relationship that we would call romantic today, but they couldn't understand it from their time. If you liked the video, I would be very happy, grateful, and everything else about a like and subscribe. It really helps a lot. Thank you, bye!